The jungle of Guyana does not mourn. It does not lower its voice for the dead. It simply continues. The insects, the heat, the relentless green pressing in from every side. On the morning of November 19, 1978, a Guyanese Defense Force unit made its way along a dirt path toward the agricultural settlement known as Jonestown and found something that would take days for the human mind to fully comprehend. There were bodies everywhere, not scattered, as in a battle, arranged. Many lay face down in the grass, arms draped over neighbors and strangers as if they had simply leaned into each other and gone to sleep. Mothers held children against their chests. Elderly men lay beside teenagers they had known for years. The colors of their clothing, purple, yellow, white, stood out against the red soil like a field of fallen flowers. The smell reached the soldiers before they were close enough to count. 918 people. The first journalist to land in the region would later describe a paralysis that took hold of them at the edge of the clearing, a failure of the mind to accept what the eyes were delivering. There was no frame of reference. There was no prior event in modern history that looked like this. Not a war, not a natural disaster, a community, a church, a congregation that had walked to this jungle voluntarily, built this place with their own hands, and on the orders of one man, had died here together in a single afternoon. His name was Jim Jones, and for more than 2 decades, he had convinced thousands of people that he was the closest thing to God they would ever know. I was not there when they found the bodies. By that morning, I was already gone, bruised, dehydrated, hiding in a drainage ditch 3 miles from what had been my home for the past 18 months. I was 22 years old, and every person I had loved since childhood was lying in that field. I did not know that yet. I would not know the full number for days. What I knew in that ditch, with the insects and the mud and the sound of my own breathing, was that something I had been taught to call faith had just tried to kill me. This is the story of how Jim Jones built a church that became a prison, and how 918 people came to believe that dying together was a better choice than living free. It is also the story of what that tells us about the hunger for meaning, the vulnerability of devotion, and the specific way that power corrupts when it wraps itself in the language of God. James Warren Jones was born in 1931 in the small town of Crete, Indiana, during the worst years of the Great Depression. His childhood was marked by poverty, an absent father, and a mother who worked constantly and left her son largely to his own devices. Neighbors later recalled a boy unusually preoccupied with death, who organized elaborate funerals for animals in the backyard, who preached to other children with an intensity that unsettled their parents. He was searching for something early, and he found it in the one place where a young man with no money, no connections, and an extraordinary talent for speaking could build a kingdom from nothing: the church. By the early 1950s, Jones had begun his ministry in Indianapolis. He was not yet the man he would become. In those years, he was genuinely ahead of his time. A white pastor who insisted on racial integration in his congregation at a moment when such a position was not merely countercultural, but dangerous. He sat black members beside white members. He marched for civil rights. He opened his church to the poor, the addicted, the elderly that no one else wanted. His gospel was not abstract. It was practical. He fed people. He housed people. He healed people, or appeared to. The healing services became his signature. Jones would call out names, describe ailments he could not possibly have known, produce what appeared to be tumors extracted from bodies. People wept. People rose from wheelchairs, the auditorium filled with testimonies. What the congregation did not see was the network of informants Jones had carefully cultivated. People who gathered personal information about newcomers in advance, who visited homes and collected medical histories, who made it possible for their pastor to appear omniscient. The tumors were chicken livers. The miracles were theater. But the people who came to James Jones were not fools. They were desperate, and there is a difference. In the 1950s and 1960s, for a black family in America, the options for dignity were narrow, and the injuries were constant. Here was a white pastor who looked you in the eye and said your life had value, who built you a community, who protected you practically and visibly from a world that largely did not. The fraudulent healings were the headline, but the real mechanism was something more profound. He gave people belonging. My mother was one of them. She joined the People's Temple in 1965 in Los Angeles when I was 9 years old. She had spent 8 years doing domestic work in other people's houses. She had been spoken to in ways I will not repeat. She walked into that church on a Tuesday evening and heard a man tell her that God did not love the rich more than the poor, that America's hierarchies were a lie, that the kingdom he was building would have no first class and no second class. She came home and told me she had found the truth. I believed her because she was my mother. I kept believing because the temple in those early years was genuinely the warmest place I had ever been. The first place where no one seemed to be performing something other than what they were. Jones moved his growing congregation to Northern California in the late 1960s, and what had begun as a church increasingly resembled something else, a movement with its own economy, its own security apparatus, its own mechanisms for controlling information. Members were encouraged to donate their savings, their properties, their wages, not by force, not at first, by persuasion, by community pressure, by the theological argument that private ownership was a form of selfishness incompatible with the new society Jones was building. And people gave because they believed, and because by that point many had no other community to return to. The temple cultivated isolation the way other churches cultivate tithing, systematically, patiently, as an act of spiritual formation. Family members outside the congregation were described as dangerous, as agents of a hostile world. News from outside was filtered. Members were taught that the FBI, the CIA, and the American government were conspiring to destroy everything Jones had built. Paranoia was not a symptom in the People's Temple. It was the curriculum. The People's Temple Agricultural Project, Jonestown, was established in the jungles of Guyana between 1974 and 1977. Jones explained the choice to his members as ideological, a socialist-leaning government, distance from American imperialism, the opportunity to build the Promised Land free from interference. The real reasons were more practical. Guyana had no extradition treaty with the United States, and by 1977, the American press was beginning to ask questions that Jones could not afford to answer. The New West magazine investigation, published in August of that year, documented former members' accounts of physical beatings, financial exploitation, and systematic sexual abuse. The California welfare authorities had opened inquiries. Relatives of members had formed a group called the Concerned Relatives and were writing letters to Congress. Jones moved the core of his congregation, more than 900 people, to Guyana before the walls could close any further. I was 20 years old when I arrived in Jonestown. My mother had told me it was paradise. What I found was a cleared patch of jungle the size of a few city blocks, surrounded on all sides by forests so dense it absorbed sound within 20 meters of its edge. There were wooden dormitories without proper walls, a large central pavilion where Jones broadcast his sermons over loudspeakers at all hours, agricultural fields where members worked 6 days a week in equatorial heat that reached over 90 degrees before mid-morning. There were armed guards at the perimeter. Our passports had been collected upon arrival and stored in the temple's administrative building. Mail was read before it left or arrived. There were no telephones accessible to ordinary members. And there were the White Nights. Jim Jones called them that. White Nights, the emergency drills, the rehearsals for what he described as revolutionary suicide. A siren would sound in the middle of the night, sometimes at 2 in the morning, sometimes at 4. Members would assemble in the central pavilion, regardless of age, regardless of health. Jones, his voice increasingly slurred from the prescription drugs and alcohol that were by then consuming him rapidly, would announce over the microphone that the enemies had come, that mercenaries were at the gates, that the time had arrived. Vats would be brought forward containing a red liquid. Members were told to drink. Some did immediately. Others hesitated, only to be moved by guards toward the vats. All were told eventually that the drink had not been poisoned, that it had been a test of their loyalty and commitment. The first time it happened, I drank without hesitating. The second time, I stood at the edge of the pavilion and watched the faces around me. My mother's face, the face of a woman I had known since I was 11, the faces of children who had been born inside the temple and had never known any other life, and I felt something crack open in a place I could not name. Not rebellion, not courage, something quieter and more frightening. The realization that I could no longer locate the boundary between what I believed and what I had been instructed to believe. The two had become indistinguishable, and a small part of me, a part I worked very hard to suppress, was beginning to suspect that this was exactly what Jones had always intended. By 1978, Jones was barely coherent during the long nightly broadcasts that crackled from the speakers across the settlement. He ranted about enemies gathering in the darkness. He described elaborate government plots against the community. He spoke of soldiers coming to slaughter their children. Members who questioned anything, food rationing, work assignments, the internal logic of a particular rule, were brought before the full community in sessions called catharsis meetings, where they confessed their failures publicly and were humiliated in front of everyone they knew, or, in some documented cases, physically beaten. Children were not exempt from these sessions. The elderly were not exempt. No one was exempt. The concerned relatives outside were not wrong about what was happening inside those walls, but those of us living in Jonestown did not have access to their letters, their congressional testimonies, their appeals. We had each other, the jungle, the loudspeakers, and a man who told us every day that the world beyond the tree line wanted us dead. When you have no exit and no information that contradicts the room you are in, you find a way to make peace with that room. Not because you are weak, because the human mind is not designed to sustain unbearable dissonance indefinitely with no avenue of relief. Congressman Leo Ryan arrived in Jonestown on November 17, 1978. He had come at the request of the Concerned Relatives Group, bringing with him a delegation of journalists, congressional aides, and relatives of members. Jones permitted the visit under considerable external pressure. Refusing it outright would have looked worse than accepting it. For that single afternoon, Jonestown performed. The food was noticeably better than what members ate most days. The music was louder. The central pavilion was arranged with care. Members had been told, firmly, to smile. Ryan ate dinner with the community and told accompanying reporters that conditions appeared better than he had anticipated. But that night, notes began to be passed. Quietly, slipped beneath dinner plates or pressed into the hands of Ryan's aides in doorways and along dark pathways, came handwritten messages. People wanted out. 16 members approached the congressional delegation before the evening was over and asked to leave with them the following morning. Then more. Jones watched this happening from his seat at the front of the pavilion and said nothing publicly. Accounts from survivors suggest that by the time the first note was passed, he had already decided what the following day would bring. On the morning of November 18, the defectors were loaded onto trucks heading for the Port Kaituma airstrip, 15 miles from the settlement. The journalists and Ryan's team traveled with them. As the first aircraft began to load its passengers, a tractor hauling a flatbed trailer appeared at the edge of the runway. The men on the trailer were armed. They opened fire on the crowd at the aircraft. Congressman Leo Ryan was killed on that tarmac. 3 journalists were killed. One of the defecting members was killed. Others were wounded or fled into the surrounding jungle. Back in Jonestown, Jim Jones called the community together for the last time. The audio recording of what followed was recovered from the wreckage and preserved by the FBI. It has been studied, transcribed, and analysed more than almost any document from that era. Jones's voice on the tape is the voice of a man who has passed the point of reason, thick with whatever he had taken that day, operatic with grievance, yet carrying beneath all of it the same cadence as every sermon he had ever delivered, the same rhetorical architecture, the same rhythms of urgency and intimacy and authority that had moved people for 20 years, now bent entirely toward a single purpose. He told the congregation that Ryan's murder meant the authorities would come, that soldiers would arrive and would not be gentle with the children, that the only dignified response, the only response that history would honor, was to die together on their own terms. He called it revolutionary suicide. He called it a protest against the conditions of an inhumane world. The vat was brought forward. This time there was no announcement that it was a test. It contained Flavor Aid, a powdered fruit drink, mixed with potassium cyanide, Valium, and a sedative called Phenergan. Medical staff who had spent years caring for members of the congregation now stood before those same members and administered the mixture. Jones's most devoted followers went first, some voluntarily, some carried forward by the momentum of a lifetime of obedience that had, by this particular moment, no remaining mechanism for refusal. Syringes were prepared for those who would not or could not drink. Children were given the mixture first, administered by nurses and by parents who had been told, and who may genuinely have believed, that they were protecting their children from something worse. I was not in the central pavilion when it began. I had been assigned that week to work in the supply building near the eastern perimeter of the settlement, cataloguing medical equipment. When the siren sounded and Jones's voice came through the outdoor speakers, I did what years of conditioning had trained me to do. I moved toward the pavilion, and then I stopped. I cannot explain precisely what happened in that moment. I have tried to reconstruct it for years, and I have never found language adequate to it. What I remember is standing on the path between the supply building and the pavilion, hearing Jones's voice on the speakers, and feeling a stillness descend on me that was unlike anything I had experienced in 13 years inside the temple. Not peace, not courage, not even conscious decision. Just stillness, as though something in the body had resolved itself before the mind was consulted. I turned around. I walked back to the supply building. I found a gap in the rotting boards at the base of the floor and I crawled underneath. I pressed my face into the dirt and lay there while the world I had lived inside for my entire conscious life ended 100 meters away. The sounds lasted approximately 45 minutes. I do not know how long I remained under that floor after the sounds stopped. Long enough for the light coming through the gaps in the boards to shift from afternoon to evening to dark. When it was fully night and the jungle had consumed whatever human sound remained, I crawled out. I did not walk toward the pavilion. Something in me already understood, without being able to articulate it, that there was nothing in that direction I could afford to see. I moved toward the tree line in the direction I believed was east, toward a road I had heard existed somewhere through the jungle, and I walked. I walked through complete darkness, falling repeatedly on roots and stones I could not see, cutting my arms on branches, navigating by sound and by the faint gradient of the ground beneath my feet. I drank from a stream I found by sound. I kept walking. By the time the sky began to lighten, I had put enough distance between myself and Jonestown that the smell no longer reached me, and I found the drainage ditch near the road where I would stay through most of the following day, too exhausted and frightened to move further, listening for sounds of pursuit that never materialized. A Guyanese Defense Force patrol found me late on the afternoon of November 19th. They brought me to a relief post at Port Kaituma and sat me in a folding chair and gave me water. A young soldier told me what had been found. He used a number that my mind simply refused to process as real. I asked him to repeat it. He did. 918. In the days and weeks that followed, the world attempted to make sense of Jonestown through the tools available to it. They were a cult. They were brainwashed. They were people unusually vulnerable to manipulation, unusually isolated from the protections of ordinary life. They were not like other people. These categories offered comfort because they created distance, because they made Jonestown into an aberration, a terrible exception, something that revealed a flaw in specific individuals rather than a possibility latent in human communities more broadly. The survivors did not find comfort in those categories. What they carried out of the jungle was more complicated and considerably less reassuring. They had loved the people who died. They had believed what Jones told them. Not everything, Not always, but enough, and for long enough. The manipulation had not felt like manipulation from inside it. It had felt like community, like purpose, like the answer to a hunger they had not previously been able to name. My mother was 51 years old when she died in that pavilion. She had spent 13 years building something she believed in. She had given the temple her savings, her labor, her social world, her daughter's childhood, and finally, her life. I do not know whether, at the end, she chose to drink, or whether the choice was made for her. I will never know. What I know is that she was not a fool. She was not mentally ill. She was not a person without judgment. She was a woman who had experienced real suffering in a world that offered her narrow paths to dignity. And she found a man who told her he was building something better. And she gave him everything she had, because everything she had seen in her life told her that this kind of offer did not come along twice. Jonestown did not happen because 900 people were credulous or weak. It happened because Jim Jones understood something precise and devastating about human need, the need to belong, to be seen, to matter, to participate in something larger than oneself. These are not weaknesses particular to certain kinds of people. They are among the most fundamental characteristics of being human. And they are exactly what every manipulative structure, from the most overtly violent to the most institutionally respectable, has always understood how to reach. Jones did not begin with poison. He began with food for the hungry and dignity for the humiliated. The distance between Indianapolis in 1955 and Jonestown in 1978 was not a sudden drop. It was a gradual narrowing of information, of outside relationships, of the internal space required to ask questions. By the time the questions mattered most, the capacity to ask them had been methodically dismantled, 1 year at a time, 1 degree of isolation at a time, 1 white night at a time. This is not a story unique to one man or one congregation. The mechanisms Jones employed, the control of information, the manufacture of external enemies, the equation of doubt with betrayal, the progressive severing of connections outside the group, are not his invention. They are a technology with a long history. They have appeared across centuries and continents, in organizations that never made international headlines, and in ones that did. They appear in structures that call themselves churches. They appear in structures that call themselves political movements. They appear wherever someone with sufficient need for control encounters a community with sufficient hunger for meaning. The question that Jonestown leaves us with is not how 900 people could have followed Jim Jones to the end. That question has an answer, and the answer is uncomfortable because it does not require any special category of human being. The more difficult question is what conditions made that following possible, and whether, inside the communities that surround us now, we would have the information and the freedom and the practiced habit of doubt necessary to recognize those conditions from inside them. That question does not have a simple answer. It may be the most important question this story asks. This documentary was produced using artificial intelligence-generated images and video for illustrative purposes. The historical events depicted are based on documented sources including FBI investigative records, survivor testimonies, congressional hearings, and investigative journalism from the period. The survivor character presented in this narrative is a composite figure created to represent the documented experience of multiple real survivors. All historical figures are referenced by their real names. No events have been fabricated or materially altered.